Could you see a scenario where the Russians lose the Far East decides to, I don't know, secede, and then the Chinese sort of find a way to not annex it, but, encourage that it becomes much more dependent on China, rather? Or is that too far-fetched?
It seems far-fetched in the modern day, but historically, it's not a far-fetched thing at all. These types of things happen all the time. I guess the only difference today is that Russia is a nuclear power. To this particular scenario, I don't think it's far-fetched at all that China gets control of the Far East in one way or another. You mentioned Russia is losing control. That's something I've noticed too. First of all, Russia's lost their ability to adequately fund the police forces in a lot of these regions, and that's directly because of the war in Ukraine. Provide the police force that traditionally came from the central government in Moscow, and so that has been taken over in many areas by vigilante groups. There's some speculation that these vigilante groups are actually funded by oligarchs.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back to The Global Gambit, where we look at the relationship between geopolitics, economic statecraft, and international relations. And we often focus on the Russia-Ukraine war. And when I have guests on, I like to focus on a particular angle. And someone who does an incredible job of being able to tackle multiple angles in his thorough videos is Paul Wahlberg, who's also the host and or runner, shall we say, of the Icarus Project YouTube channel. Now, some of you know Paul from a previous conversation we had, but the reason I was very keen to have Paul back, apart from the fact he knows what he's talking about, is because he did some interesting analysis of Russia and China. Now, those of you who know my background understand my skepticism and long-term questioning of the viability of that relationship. More of a marriage of convenience in my mind. But anyway, those are the sorts of things we're going to cover with Paul in part one, and then we're going to have a broader conversation about sort of the United States, the peace plan in part two. But Paul, it's lovely to have you back. I guess, sort of when you look at the relationship between Russia and China right now, Putin's in India, that's obviously this triad, if you like, of the dynamics here. What are you taking away initially? What do you mainly emphasize to viewers to focus on?
It's mainly what you said. It's very obvious that this is a marriage of convenience. It might be a marriage, but we've seen China very willing to break up the relationship and cause tension in the marriage whenever it's not convenient for them. So we've seen a couple things throughout the war, but some of them have manifested recently. Probably the biggest sign we've seen recently is when secondary sanctions were finally kind of threatened on Chinese firms if they continued to purchase from Lukoil and Rosneft, China very quickly backed down and stopped purchasing oil from Russia. On top of this, we've seen, in the past, China purchasing oil from Russia. Sure, that's helping them out. A lot of people are missing that they are negotiating steep discounts when they do that. And even as China is also negotiating, for example, potential of new pipelines from Siberia in Russia to China to meet China's energy needs, China is always really pushing Russia really hard on price and trying to get bottom dollar. I'd say top dollar if they were selling, but they're trying to get bottom dollar. They're trying to get Russia to concede a lot of things to them. And so when we look at the relationship between Russia and China, China is doing things that some perceive to be helping Russia out, but China isn't doing those things because they're helping Russia. China's doing those things because they're good for China, and we can really clearly see when it stops being good for China, China stops doing those actions, and they turn inwardly on themselves. And that shows us that China is not an ideological ally with Russia, or even if they are, they don't put their ideological alliance with Russia above their alliance of convenience, for example, with Western countries.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point. I have another example I'm curious for your thoughts on in a moment, but sort of to be devil's advocate, people might argue, but how can one small example of one specific potential set of secondary sanctions, how can that point to the overall direction of Sino-Russo relations? Are we not overblowing this reaction from China?
Yeah, and like I said, it's just the most recent example. It's certainly not the only example. The pipeline example is a big one, but really it goes down to understanding the relationship between China and Russia in terms of history, and asking yourself what should be the most natural operating assumption about that relationship. Should our most natural operating assumption be that China and Russia are allies, or should it be that they're opponents? And when we look at history, it's always that they're opponents. We see that between the Soviet Union. I know it's not exactly Russia, but we see that between the Soviet Union and China, where even when they were both ideologically communist, they were fighting against each other, literally fighting against each other, not just with words, but literally fighting against each other to decide, who would lead the communist world. And so each of these countries has this desire for dominance in its sphere of the world, and they'll align with each other where needed, but they still try to get the best of each other. When we look historically again at their relationship, there's examples from not very long ago where the Soviet Union, again not modern day Russia, but the Soviet Union, actually threatened to nuke China at times, and they actually asked the United States for permission to nuke China. Like, hey, if we nuke China, will you please not nuke us back? And the United States said no. All of these things point to deeper fractures in a relationship. And if you go even further back, Russia historically stole a lot of lands that China still claims to be theirs, and a lot of it comes down to Russia is in control of these sparsely populated territories in their east that have a whole lot of resources. China has a huge population, even if it's less than what they say, which, is a topic a lot of people are talking about lately. China still has a huge population and they're resource poor, particularly in the resources that Russia can provide. And so that's caused these tensions historically. And what we're seeing right now in the modern day, where Russia and China are going before media cameras and they are saying with their words that they have a no limits partnership, that is actually the exception. It's not the norm. And so when we are examining that modern relationship, their words are the exception and not the norm. We have to examine their actual actions and not just those words. And when we look at the actual actions, those consistently seem to actually be on the theme of the historical tensions between them and not a no limits partnership.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think it's always the case. Don't look at what's being said, but what's being signaled. The policy moves behind the provocative, performative statements or whatever. I mean, you also make me think of the sort of, it brings me to this whole idea that China really benefits from almost exploiting Russia to a certain extent because of its over dependence. I don't know if you'd agree with that wording, but like the other recent example I come to is Siberia 2 pipeline, obviously, because the Russians have been at war, sort of feuding over the Chinese over the price, but they need it, and I think they finalized it later in the summer or something like that. But what's your take there? Is that literally just the case of the Chinese overwhelming the Russians because they need that income?
Yeah, so they haven't finalized the pipeline, just to be clear, and the details are important because it kind of answers your question. They have, after many years of negotiating, reached an agreement in principle that China would be okay with the pipeline being built. But what they haven't agreed on is who's going to pay to build the pipeline. Right. And they haven't agreed on what price China is going to pay for the energy. Now, historically, in the previous Siberia pipeline, I can't remember how long it took, but it took a long period of time. I think like a period of 5 or 10 years. We could look it up exactly. It doesn't really matter. The point is it took a long time. And even after they reached agreement, China continued to negotiate on price. And what we know about China's negotiations with price on the Power Siberia 2 in particular is China had already basically been demanding, I was going to say asking, but they're really demanding from Russia a price that is equivalent to the subsidized price that Russian citizens pay, which is basically a price that is at production cost or just above production cost. Basically, Russia doesn't make any profit. And so when China is looking at a Power Siberia 2 pipeline, I'm assuming they're still pushing for a price similar to that, financially benefiting Russia. The benefit to Russia is that they can keep the gas flowing and they can keep that relationship going, and they can prevent themselves from having to turn off, gas infrastructure that could freeze up and become expensive to fix. But it really is, you use the word exploitation, which is China exploiting Russia, and it really does seem that way, where they are trying to get Russia to treat Chinese citizens with the same benefits that they give to their own citizens. And let's be honest, cheap natural gas is one of the few benefits you actually get for being a Russian citizen.
Mm. Yeah, no, I mean, I have personal experience from that. Parts of my family or extended friends who are based around Siberia or southern Russia, around like Rostov sort of thing. They said there's been a lot more advertisement or just increase of Chinese merchandise, produce, obviously partially because of the sanctions, but because of this deepening of ties. But I think what's interesting, Paul, and I'd love your take on this, is, last year, it kind of goes back to what we first started talking about, which was when the Russians and the North Koreans, they signed a strategic partnership. China was relatively and surprisingly mute about that. And from my take, it was because whilst the North Koreans and the Russians are pretty similar, in the West they'd be called rogue states or they are reckless, China is not okay with that. China's against sort of Western or American hegemony, but they're not the same in terms of recklessness because they benefit from the prevailing economic system as it is. So they're not going to endorse these two budding up because it could bring more of the attention onto the East Asia theatre and ultimately be a detriment to their interests. I don't know if you focused on that sort of triangular relationship as well, or if that has any symbolism for the bilateral relations between Russia and China.
I haven't put a lot of focus on that triangular relationship, but the points you make are good. Where China, and again, it shows China isn't as ideological as most people think. They're a little bit more practical. When they get upset, for example, about Russia and North Korea partnering, or at least they kind of stay mute on that, which is kind of not tacit acceptance, it's tacit upset. I don't know what the word is, upsetness with China if they're mute. Because everybody would expect that China would be kind of cool with this. There's these, two powers that are so against the West, as you say. But your point is good. Like, China doesn't want all this attention coming on their sphere of the world. They don't want to get bundled in with these two powers. And that's partly why I think China has also been relatively mute on the war in Ukraine. They've given some tacit support to Russia, but they haven't, come out to say, like, specifically, like, we want Russia to win, or at least they didn't. I think maybe they did. Some people said that recently, but early in the war, they didn't. It shows that China values its relationship with the West more than a lot of people think. And they value their relationship with the West, I think, more than they value their relationship with North Korea and Russia, except for the fact that those two countries actually border them. Because when we look at what has allowed China to prosper, it is their trade with the West. Europe and the United States and other countries that are traditionally considered Western. These are all countries with the biggest economies. We are the ones who have allowed China to become this manufacturing hub of the world because we buy those products. And that isn't just, money for China. It's power. It's their power base of this ability to create prosperity for their people. That's how they build up their national dialogue within their own country. And that's dependent on them actually increasing the living standards of their people. And again, that all depends on the West. So if their relationships with the West are somehow severed, all of a sudden they lose the markets for all of this mass production infrastructure that they've built up. There's not enough people within China to consume everything that China can create, and they find themselves in a really bad situation where they have all this infrastructure and it has no use. That's not the same with Russia and North Korea. And so, to your point, I think China is very cautious about taking sides with both of these countries too explicitly.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I don't know, if you look at the top 10, 10 trading partners of China, most of them are Western or American allies or partners, right? Like Japan, South Korea, Philippines, even India to an extent. And on India, as I said earlier, Putin is currently in India, or maybe he's finally flown back. What's your take there in terms of sort of India? Because they've been buying huge amounts of military equipment from Russia or the Soviet Union for decades. But obviously, if you sort of have a bolstered India supported by Russia, what does that mean for China? Because they're not exactly keen about that. So it puts a bit of in English we say, a fly in the ointment, right?
Of course, yeah. You can't understand Indian relations to Russia or Chinese relations to Russia or Chinese relations to India, Indian relations to China without understanding the full dynamic with all of them. It really is a complicated situation where you have these three major powers, or at least Russia traditionally was considered a major power. India might not be considered a major power in the traditional sense, but they have a huge population, and they could do a lot in terms of military, even if they're not the United States, for example. You have these three major powers who have all these traditional border disputes, and this goes back to the Cold War period, where they're kind of all serving as hedges against each other. That's part of the reason, in the war in Ukraine, the world hasn't really worked that hard to completely stop Indian purchases of Russian oil, because the world understands, the people in charge understand that, if India falls too far behind China, that actually strengthens China. And so they would rather see India be strengthened by being able to partner with Russia to a degree, because India serves as a hedge against China. It all gets very complicated. And you have to think of the broader geopolitical goals, which, of course, the biggest item right now is the war between Russia and Ukraine and Europe. But what comes after that, and obviously most people would think what might come after that, is a conflict with China. So India being bolstered somehow to be stronger in case of a conflict with China, whether that means buying Russian oil or whether that means buying Russian military equipment. That is something that the West is willing to accept. And it's something that India does because India is always afraid of the Western world siding more with China. And it's been that way since the Western world, India and Pakistan have a lot of conflicts. It's been that way since the Western world tried to side with both India and Pakistan, which India saw as basically tacit support for Pakistan and China rather than mediation. I know I'm going into a lot of things that I'm not exploring in depth. My point is it's all very complicated. And if India purchases from Russia, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're aligned with Russia per se. It just means that they understand as a practical matter in their minds that they need to maintain some kind of hedge against China, and they don't trust the West to be that hedge. And I think in particular, as the West has failed to adequately support Ukraine in their war, India, they probably get more nervous about Western support for themselves. And it gets complicated. And we realize the consequences where what we do in one theater has backdoor effects in the other theaters. I went into a lot. So if you want to unpack anything in particular.
No, I mean, I've got sort of a three-pronged interlinking question to pose to you about this. I mean, great power politics is my specialty. It's what I did my master's in, because I just think it's fascinating. We can argue about what constitutes a great power, but I don't think it's impossible to deny India is becoming more relevant, purely because it has a ability to be desired by every party that we've mentioned, but it isn't pulled into the sphere of any one. That strategic autonomy is what they do so well. But on that, or in international relations, we have pull and pull factors is another way you could put it, right? But what I wanted to ask you a little bit more is about this sort of how China, we talked about it initially, sort of the exploitation. Now, one of the biggest arguments is that Russia is becoming a client state. It's simply becoming vassalized. Do you agree with that? Do you think it's a little bit too extreme yet? Or there are signals to say that it's happening or happened?
I like the term it's becoming. Obviously, I wouldn't say it has become a vassal state. Russia still has sovereignty over that territory, and they'll do everything they can to keep it that way. But the terminology of becoming a vassal state, it seems to be certainly true. If China really is being able to strong arm Russia into deals where they are giving resources to China essentially at cost, I mean, that is the definition of a vassal state, right? You are subjecting yourself economically to the interests of another country, basically for that country's protection, or to appease that country so that they don't invade you and take control in a more practical sense. So there's that aspect. There's also aspects where Russia has feared becoming a vassal state of China for years. And I look at this logic a little backwards. It's like, well, if Russia fears this, obviously they know it's a real possibility. Otherwise, they wouldn't take so many actions against it. And so this goes back to the inception of modern Russia as a state from the collapse of the Soviet Union. Almost right away, they went into something called the Yellow Peril, where they became terrified of China coming in and culturally taking over Siberia and essentially controlling their resources. Where Chinese companies, and you have to remember Chinese companies are controlled by the government. The Chinese Communist Party ultimately controls companies. Chinese companies are coming into Russia and they're leasing a lot of the resources in Siberia. And as they're leasing those resources, they're bringing in Chinese workforces to operate them, to the point that in a lot of areas, the signage and the restaurants and the stores, a lot of that is in Mandarin and not in Russian. And so China kind of has de facto control of a lot of areas of Russia, even if the borders haven't been redrawn. And that comes back to basically resource control. So, we can argue and we can quibble on the specifics of whether Russia is technically considered a vassal state of China, but certainly in many aspects they are.
Interesting. It's obviously then we talk about the yellow peril, but also just generally territorial interests. I'm specifically referring to August 2023 when the Chinese released a very provocative map of sort of Greater China, if you like. And it was, I mean, I can put a picture on the screen now for people just so they know what I'm talking about. But basically, it pissed off everybody in the surrounding area. And it wasn't a big necessary bit of territory, but there was a bit of territory of what we know as sovereign Russia in the Far East that was under now part of this bigger China bloc or bit, whatever. new extra territory. And the Russians were very silent on that. What's your take there? And to expand on it a little bit further, but obviously there is Manchuria, 1969, 71, whatever it was, border clash between the Soviets and the Chinese. That's still pretty, as you say, fresh in the minds of many people. Could China, basically my question is, could China actually try to take back eastern parts of Asia or the Far East?
Or at least they could threaten to do so to get de facto control from Russia in response for Russia to try to assuage China from doing a more traditional type of invasion. So the map updates you're referring to, primarily I believe you're referring to when China basically redrew all of Bolshoy-Ussuriysky Island, or what China would call the Greater Ussuri Island, into Chinese control. But what China also did is they renamed a lot of Russian cities on their maps to the traditional Chinese names, which might seem like a small thing, but you have to realize that's what China has done with India. That's what China's done with the South China Sea. When China redraws their maps, they're not just redrawing maps. They are being intentionally provocative to see what the response will be. And in some way they're conveying their intentions. And so it seems that China has some intentions for certain parts of Russia in the future, or at least they want to convey to their people that they have that as a show of strength internally. And so when we look at Bolshoy-Ussuriysky Island in particular, as you mentioned, it's not a particularly large piece of territory, but it's an incredibly significant piece of territory. This is a specific piece of territory that Russia and China fought a small-scale war over. Well, I guess not Russia, but the Soviet Union. You know what I mean? And the ultimate conclusion of that was basically China and Russia would split control of the island, but neither of them would develop it. In a sense, you could consider it almost a demilitarized zone. At least in practice, that's basically what it became. And that was the status quo for many years. China and Russia shared control. Nobody could develop it. That changed with the war in Ukraine, where China drew the entire island into their territory. And China, you mentioned Russia was silent on it. I actually don't think Russia was silent on it. They tried to be as silent as they could. But one thing Russia did was they actually allowed for the development of the island after China claimed it on their maps. So they were silent to the international world, but they weren't silent in terms of their actions. They actually took an action that was essentially a concession to China, a breaking of many decades worth of status quo. Now, this island, what's so significant, it sits across the river. I think it's the Amur River. I can't remember. There's two rivers that converge right there. Across from the biggest city in this region of Siberia, which is Khabarovsk. And one of the reasons it's always been demilitarized is because controlling the island puts you in artillery range of Khabarovsk and basically also allows you to control traffic up these rivers, which are navigable rivers. And so if China can control and develop this island and fortify it in some way, that actually gives them access to a river system that, if you look at a map, it cuts the far east of Russia in half, and outer Manchuria cuts it roughly in half, and basically allows China to isolate each side of that river from supplies and reinforcements. So from a military perspective, if China wanted to invade Siberia or the Russian Far East, this island would probably be the single most significant piece of territory. And so China kind of claiming it on their map with the historical background, with its military context, it is a big deal.
No, you've certainly gone into a lot more tactical military analysis than I have on this detail. It kind of reminds me of the sort of symbolic relevance that the Kuril Islands do in the dispute between the Russians and the Japanese. But to that point then, there's a lot of discussion about fragmentation of Russia. This is overblown, to be honest. But where I do see it more feasible are sort of the North Caucasus, and more relevant for our conversation, the Far East. Because as far as I can see, there isn't really much ability for the Russians to effectively govern that. Well, it's just Russia's huge, right? It just doesn't have that centralization that maybe America does more because of infrastructure, telecoms, and all that sort of stuff. Could you see a scenario where the Russians lose the Far East decides to, secede, and then the Chinese sort of find a way to not annex it, but, encourage that it becomes much more dependent on Russia or on China rather, or is that too far-fetched?
It seems far-fetched in the modern day, but historically, it's not a far-fetched thing at all. These types of things happen all the time. I guess the only difference today is that Russia is a nuclear power. Some people consider that to be very significant. Some people see it as less significant to this particular scenario. I don't think it's far-fetched at all that China gets control of the Far East in one way or another. You mentioned Russia is losing control. That's something I've noticed too. I'm actually this morning before this interview, I was writing a video for the Icarus project on this exact topic. So a little plug there.
Well, quote me in it, right? You know, you've got your best
Yeah.
quote from. Not that.
Yeah, absolutely. But Russia is losing control in Siberia and the Far East in several ways. And when I say losing control, I mean that in a very practical sense. First of all, Russia's lost their ability to adequately fund the police forces in a lot of these regions. And that's directly because of the war in Ukraine. It goes not just to funding, but also because a lot of the able-bodied men went to the war. And so there's less recruits, things like that. Long story short, Russia's lost their ability to provide the police force that traditionally came from the central government in Moscow. And so that has been taken over in many areas by vigilante groups. There's some speculation that these vigilante groups are actually funded by oligarchs. It's a very interesting thing in and of itself, but we'll stay focused on China today with the Ukrainian drone attacks on refineries that has affected Siberia and the Far East in a practical way. They've had the bulk of the shortages, or at least the worst of the shortages, and that is, you can see that as the central government losing control in a way, because they are showing to their people that they can no longer provide military protection, which if you just think of a traditional sense of empire, one of the main reasons additionally doled out by the regional governments, and these regional governments no longer have the budget to provide these benefits, and Moscow basically doesn't have the funds to provide them to them either. And so economically, this has been a lifeline that's kept a lot of people loyal to Moscow, because these funds are huge and it's been subsidizing their economies throughout the war, and that's going away now too. And so the practical senses of why people stick with the central government, like in Moscow, those are going away. They don't have police protection, they don't have military protection, and they don't have economic benefit. And so people would start asking the question, this has happened historically in every region that's ever faced this. People are at least asking the question, what benefit do we get of sticking with Russia? And then that's where China comes into the picture. Would China ever take over the Far East? And there's a couple ways they could do this. There's obviously the military invasion. There's also the threat of the military invasion to get concessions from Russia. And I think with Russia's current economic situation, there's a possibility that could play out in an economic standpoint, where at the end of this war, Russia is going to need money one way or another, and they're going to probably be forced to make concessions one way or another. And a scenario that could happen, I'm not saying it will happen, but that could happen, is that China could basically offer to purchase portions of the Far East and Siberia back from Russia, again, not from Russia, but back from Russia, because they were historically Chinese, in exchange for basically bailing out the Russian government so they don't face a total economic collapse. So there's a lot of ways that China could take over this region. The people are probably looking for new benefactors. China could position themselves as that new benefactor, and as that's happening simultaneously, they could be working with the Russian government to make a purchase.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I would also add to that just the growth, the emergence, relevance of the Arctic, right? Arctic geopolitics is something I've always been interested in, but when the Chinese called themselves a near Arctic power, but maybe because they then access it much clearer through the Far East and the ports up there, or Vladivostok, plays into their grand strategy, I think.
Absolutely.
Much to the, I think, dislike of the Russians. So I guess my last question on this half is simply that some people have argued the idea of a reverse Kissinger. We've made references to the US in passing, but, during the Soviet Union or Cold War, the idea by Henry Kissinger was to bring China on side against the Soviet Union. And people sort of suggest, does the Trump administration try to do the same? Trump and Putin are pretty chummy, let's be honest. So they're trying to bring the Russians closer to the West or America against China. Do you think that holds any credibility?
That's actually a really interesting concept. I haven't examined that a lot personally, but it sounds on the surface like maybe it could make sense. I think my hesitation is when I look at the Trump administration, I don't see them as having a big grand plan in terms of geopolitics. Like, I don't see a Kissinger-like figure in the Trump administration who's actually thinking like, oh, we should bring on Russia to be a hedge against China. Now, certainly historically, people have thought that way. And we, like you mentioned, we've used China as a hedge against the Soviet Union. I don't know if that's what the Trump administration is thinking or not. It's possible, but if they are, it's a dumb strategy in my opinion, because we've all seen how weak Russia currently is against Ukraine. They're not able to be completely successful there. And if we're going to choose an ally against China, why would we choose Russia and not Europe, not NATO? our traditional alliance, which is obviously far more powerful. And even if they were equally powerful, they're not as they're not as hampered by a recent war that's destroyed their economy and their military. And so I honestly don't know what's going on in the mind of Trump when it comes to Russia or why they do things the way they do. Obviously, there's a lot of theories. Any of them could be true. It could be true that they're looking for personal profit. It could be true that they just want to end the war and get it over with so that they can, be seen as the propagators of peace in the world. It could be what you said. But either way, whatever they're doing, it's clearly not working, and they should probably consider a different strategy.
Very hard put down there by Paul Warburg, but one I do tentatively agree with. But Paul, it's been quite the journey, I think, in this first half. I really love these sorts of widespread conversations about how big players affect us all, and hopefully, people have enjoyed it. Well, stay tuned for part 2, because we're going to be chatting Ukraine, Europe, and much more on that side. We'll see you then. Is this not part of a strategy that Trump has tried before, this idea or concept of anchoring? Do you think that that's Trump's ploy here, or is that too intellectual for him?
I don't think it's too intellectual for him, because I don't think it's highly intellectual. It's a basic negotiation strategy, right? And Trump has done negotiation a lot, like on real estate deals and things like that. I actually think it's the problem, if that is his strategy, is anchoring might be a good strategy when it comes to a real estate deal where you're just trying to get money out of people and things like that. I don't think it works.